Thank you, Tom. I appreciate your kind words. And I am indeed so delighted to be back, even if it's virtual, with Jeremy Irons. As I think all of you know, my admiration for him as an actor and as a human being is boundless. Welcome to Jeremy Irons. And before we start our conversation, and I'll be asking some questions to start off, we will take questions from the chat box. I will be keeping my eye on that box throughout, and I will try to incorporate as many of the questions as I can. And now officially, welcome to Jeremy Irons, who happens to be in England, where it's 5 hours later. I hope that you are relaxed, not on stage necessarily.
I am. I'm loving all the advantages that we get from COVID. That I can be in this unknown place with a mug of beer and a cigarette, and don't have to go through customs to get to you. And although I miss the wire, I miss being there on the stage with you. There are some pluses to being a bit locked down.
This is true. So the first question is, how did you get involved with Munich, The Edge of War? What led you to say yes? I know you're offered many projects simultaneously. What was it about this one?
Well, Robert Harris, who wrote the book Munich, is a friend of mine. He was in the middle of writing Munich, and he tells me later now that he was looking at me thinking, he'd be a very good Chamberlain. And that was the book he was writing, a book about Chamberlain's 4-day conference with Hitler in Munich, with Chamberlain's effort to put off war, to stop it happening. And so he thought Jeremy wouldn't be a bad idea. So he sent me the book once it was printed, and I read it and was fascinated by it. I mean, it's an extraordinary time in history. And I very much wanted to be involved, and said to him, you know, if this gets picked up, let's do it. Unfortunately, Netflix came along and picked it up to make it into a film. So I was delighted then when Netflix thought I was a good idea, and our director, Christian Socha, also thought it was a good idea. We met in Berlin during the Berlinale, Christian and I, and had a good chat. And it sort of developed from there. And so I was involved from the very early days, so to speak.
I think it's amazing that you were involved in the actual conceptualization of the novel. I mean, Robert Harris, who also wrote Fatherland, is a best-selling writer. And that he should have your image in front of his eyes as he's creating the character of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and then his book gets published in 2017. I love that.
Yeah. Well, and of course, it's very much Robert's take on Chamberlain, because Chamberlain comes down in history. I mean, a lot of people haven't heard of Chamberlain, but he was the Prime Minister before Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister up to almost the declaration of war. And he comes down in history as the appeaser. Our history, in fact, was written by Winston Churchill, because after the war, he wrote his autobiography. And Chamberlain and Churchill didn't agree on whether we should go to war or not. Winston Churchill was very keen we should go to war in 1937 and also 1938. Chamberlain felt that we were, as a country, completely unprepared. Our Air Force was having huge problems. We didn't have the planes, we didn't have the Spitfires. Our guns froze above certain altitudes. So we were in big problems. Our Navy wasn't ready. And had we gone to war when Churchill wanted us to, which was in 1938, we would have been probably overrun within the first 7-8 months. So Churchill writes that Chamberlain was the appeaser. He was the one who was taken in by Hitler and who came back saying, I have on this piece of paper a signature from Adolf Hitler, which will guarantee peace for our time. Now, he actually always regretted saying that because he knew Hitler wasn't to be trusted, but he felt he'd bought us time to prepare. So as a result, I think he was enormously effective as a politician, very different from how he's regarded by many historians to this day. But to prove that the Munich conference was a success is that Hitler later on in 1943, 1944, blamed Chamberlain for the and the agreement they had made. He said, had we not made that agreement, had I gone to war with England in 1938, we would have won much more easily. So clearly, the outcome of the Munich conference, which is one of the things this film is about, I think reflects very well on Chamberlain.
Now, I mean, you made me completely rethink what Chamberlain represents, because history has not been kind to him, seeing him as the great appeaser. But you play him as affable, generous, and savvy. I mean, now that you've lived in his shoes, so to speak, I think that you've been able to reassess his historical role. And the fact that he asks for that joint statement with Hitler, stating that Germany will never go to war again with England. If he breaks the promise, the world will know. And that's what helped the Allies to join against Germany. So in a sense, he was ultimately successful in his strategy.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we developed in that year, which we didn't have in 38, but which we had by the time we went to war, was radar. And our radar was a huge advantage, being able to pinpoint aeroplanes and also ocean traffic. So that was important, that we had that extra year before we had to go to war. But almost more importantly was getting the country behind us. I mean, we know how long it took Roosevelt to get the American country behind the United States behind him to go to war to help us, and in fact allow us to win. It took a long time, and finally it took Pearl Harbor. Well, Chamberlain knew we just 20 years before had the First World War. So everybody living had brothers, fathers, sons who had died in that terrible conflict. And the idea of going into another conflict was completely anathema to everybody. And he believed that in 38, the country would not have wanted to go to war to save Sudetenland. Now, Sudetenland, which the Germans wanted to annex, is a part of Czechoslovakia that was German-speaking. And Hitler said, all I want to do is to get Sudetenland back into Germany. And the country wouldn't have gone to war to support Czechoslovakia on that. But once, a year later, we had the Anschluss, we've seen Austria taken over, and we saw Hitler beginning to move into Europe. Then the country was able to be galvanized to be behind the government to say, all right, we go to war against this man. So I think Robert Harris's reappraisal of Chamberlain is well overdue. And I would fight Chamberlain's corner. He was a very rather Edwardian man. He was elegant and very English in being somewhat reserved, although he had a warmth, but that rarely came over. But those who knew him knew it. And I think we owe a lot to, it's always good to reevaluate our history and to truly understand how things came about, because things never change. And we live in a world which is, pretty rocky at the moment.
Yeah.
And a world of internet where everything seems to be black and white. so I think it's very good to understand the gray areas, the difficult areas. And I think Robert, in his book, and Netflix in their film, have pointed this out. I have to say that this is really a film about two young men. Chamberlain is the background, if you like, of this story, against which these two young men play their story.
And I think that's one of the major differences from the book, if I remember correctly, because here there's a lot of focus on the tension between them and their role, which I'm going to go to one of the questions that showed up in the chat box from Jerry Holtz, who asked, what is real in terms of the historical aspect of this film and what is fiction? And I'm guessing that the two young men are indeed part of the fictional construct.
They are, although certainly the German young man is based on a German, von Trott, I think his name was, who was educated at Cambridge, who had a great friendship with A.L. Ruz, and who then went and worked within the German government, and indeed was part of the plan to assassinate Hitler. So even though the two young men are fictional, they are based loosely on characters who really existed. And of course, we know there were several plots to assassinate Hitler, and one at that time. So, but in truth, that line is fiction.
Right. Right.
I think all of Chamberlain, everything I say, really, I'm not what I say in some of the scenes which we haven't had recorded, but the speeches and his policy and his attitudes are fact.
And actually, one of the questions was indeed, was there an assassination attempt in 1937 on Hitler's life? And I gather that is the case.
Yeah, yeah. Although there were plans for that, and there was a later assassination attempt. I'm not sure of the dates.
The one that is documented in the film Valkyrie, which I remember showing at the 92nd Street Y with Tom Cruise as our guest. And even though that's got fictional elements, the basis of that one was true as well.
Yeah,
And I wanted to go back because it's also so much about how you play the character. And I'm going to quote from the review in Variety by Guy Lodge, Lodge. He wrote, Chamberlain, to whom Irons brings a melancholic, poignantly exhausted air of grace. It's easy to appreciate the restraint and intelligence with which these exchanges are written, just as there are subtle formal rewards in the film's gilded autumnal lensing and magisterial score, unquote.
great writing.
Yeah, I sometimes I find that film reviewers rise to the occasion when films invite them to, and that's an example. Could you tell us a little bit, though, not just, I understand that you researched, obviously, to play Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, how important was the costume, the makeup in incarnating this historical personage?
Well, I mean, I have some sort of he was actually not quite as tall as I am. He was thinner in the face than I am. He had extraordinary hair in that he in some photographs, it looks as if he's wearing a little sort of skull cap, because his hair in the middle was black and then he had white bits sort of round it. And we tried to match that. I grew an enormous moustache, which I would keep my lunch in, which matched, I think, his moustache. But and the formal costumes, he would often wear a tailcoat. We actually didn't show him in a tailcoat. We showed him just in a black suit and high collar, which is what he used to wear. All of that is, the external that you try to sort of match because there are photographs of this man, people know him. And so one tried to get as close as one could, but and meanwhile I'm working on the inside and trying to find the man. You know, when we see politicians, they're always on parade or normally on parade. Robert had written domestic scenes with Chamberlain, which I suppose a lot were imagined, although we have one scene in the garden at Downing Street with my wife, where I think there's an opportunity to see Chamberlain's heart, to see his real emotion. And that is taken from something he said. So we know that's really what he felt. And I was very keen to get that scene into the film, because I felt if we know, you know, if we knew, for instance, what Donald Trump really thought, behind all the bullshit, behind all of that, where was his heart? What was it? Then it would be easier to understand him. And I wanted to, or with any politician, I wanted to try to have a moment where you really understood the heart and the emotion of where this man was coming from. In those days, 1938, that's pre-Holocaust, pre-everything. But how it was at that time, how he felt. And then you lay on his public speeches and his speeches in Parliament, his radio speeches to the nation, his diplomatic activities. And you know that behind that, you know what he feels, and you know where he's coming from. And I felt that was very important. And Robert very clearly did that in the book, and I was determined that we do that with the film. And I think we've managed. I think Christian's done a wonderful balance between the thriller element of the young men and the political and emotional situation in 1938 on this little island.
Wow. By the way, I just have to tell you, I've been reading the chat boxes while listening to you, and many of the people are commenting on how extraordinarily fine your performance is, how much they liked the film Munich, The Edge of War. But Jennifer just wrote, "I love your necklace, Jeremy."
Good for you, Jennifer.
Just sharing.
Do you know where I found this? I found this on a pavement in Beijing.
Wow.
And I picked it up, it's covered in dust, and I ran it onto the tap and dried it. And I thought, well, that must have been left for me by somebody. It's a bit rusty.
It looks fantastic. It wouldn't look right on Chamberlain, but it looks good on Jeremy Irons. Now, Lila asked, did Chamberlain receive documents that outlined Hitler's strategy? Was that a fact?
He did, not in quite that way, although those documents did come to the British government, did get to the British government, but not quite as we show it.
Okay. And Eva wanted to know whether the opening scenes of the two young men at Oxford, I'm sorry if this seems silly, but did it take you back to Brideshead Revisited? That was your first major introduction. Our first introduction to you in the United States was that. So I am conveying that question.
Well, yes, I suppose it did. I mean, lying on the banks of the Thames or the Thames, with the Isis, as it is in Oxford, drinking champagne. Yes, I did that 40 years ago.
Yes. Okay. Also, a few questions about whether any of this was actually shot in Munich. In other words, the German scenes, where was that done?
Yeah, that was shot in Munich. In fact, the building that we shot the meeting was the actual building where they did the meeting. And they both went in separate doors as we show it. It's now a music school. but that was the building where it happened. Hugely impressive, and they allowed us to put up the swastikas for, I think we were allowed to have them up for 3 hours or 4 hours, and then they had to come down. They don't like them.
I think they're actually banned.
Yeah, but we got permission.
Good. And actually, Diana Pollack writes, the film implies that some world leaders already knew of the treatment killing of their Jewish citizens. Was Chamberlain aware of the degree of anti-Semitic action that was developing?
I'm not sure. I worry because I made another film about the about the Munich Olympics, and there we had a scene as I was driving in from the airport where you could see Jews being thrown out of their houses. And so that character was aware. We had none of that in his vision. And it wasn't something I was playing or thinking about knowing at that point.
Yeah. And by the way, that was the last time that you and I were on stage together at 92Y, was with the film Race, where you were playing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
That was one of the 4 times. And that
Right.
was a fascinating film, you know, especially because your character did not want to boycott Germany, and there were all kinds of questions raised there. Okay, but I'm getting so many questions coming in that I have to quickly I'm going to incorporate some of them and go back to a few of my own as well.
Well, it's great that we have such a wide and interested audience. I'm very flattered.
And well, you should be, because I know some of the people who are asking questions, and they are very smart and engaged cinephiles.
Yeah, we should have Robert Harris here. He's far more educated than I am on this.
No, but you are very articulate. You always have been, about your process in terms of getting into a character, becoming that character. I mean, the very fact that you fought to keep that scene, for me, it's one of the most moving scenes in Munich, The Edge of War, when your character admits to the vulnerability to being scarred by the carnage of World War I. And that is enough reason to fight as hard as you can not to go into another war. So these are choices that I think actors have to make as well. Linda had asked whether there were any surprises for you when you started researching Neville Chamberlain, something that you completely did not expect but incorporated.
I was surprised that he hadn't fought in the First World War. He was actually the mayor of Birmingham. He was a sort of a politician during that. He says he was too old. Well, I don't know, but anyway, he didn't. So that I hadn't known. Surprises otherwise, I think not. But it's very difficult because, you know, when you're researching, you slowly, it's like swimming. And do you have surprises? Well, the occasional wave surprises you, or the occasional feeling of seaweed on your stomach as you're going over, it sort of surprises you. But actually you come back and you think that was a great swim, and you forget about those little moments. So it's quite difficult to pick out any particular moments of surprise. A lot of it was just a learning experience about how politics work, how about diplomacy works. I was surprised that he chose to go and see Hitler the following morning in his house. I think that's a very bright thing to do. I'd never knew that's how it happened. And Robert writes that he got to Hitler's apartment, and they pressed the lift to go up to it, and the lift was broken. Well, that was very, and we didn't put that in the film. I rather wish we had. It's a nice little touch. But I think the Germans, because it's of course German director, I think they wanted to feel that that Germany might have been on the verge of war, but it was at least efficient. So he didn't like the fact the lift didn't work. We didn't put it in.
Right. Now, Jerome writes that Churchill and Chamberlain hardly agreed on anything, but Churchill eulogized Chamberlain upon his death, that there were 5 or 6 assassination attempts on Hitler's life, but none succeeded. And is there, anything that we should take from that? I have another related question, but go ahead with that one.
Well, yes, there were attempts. It's very interesting, the attempt that we cover. It's a very big step, and it's a step that I didn't have confidence. Well, well, I don't want to spoil the story, but you see in the story that actually when a chance happens, it's not taken. But yes, there were many attempts. One feels, I feel that had somebody really wanted to, that they could have done, and that it's such a momentous thing to assassinate a leader, and a leader who was for many people much admired. Germany had been sort of thrown into the mud after the First World War, and they clawed their way back, and there was a very strong feeling within the country that Hitler was the man to actually allow Germany to come back to itself, even though many of those people probably didn't want him to go to war with Europe. But there was tremendous support for him. You only have to see those rallies to know he was a charismatic figure, and provided, forget what we can't forget about the Holocaust, but put that to one side for a minute and just see politically, he galvanized the country, and one can understand why people, not knowing what was happening to the minorities, the Jews and the Gypsies and the ill, might have thought, this is the man we need.
And the dangerous thing, he was voted into office. He was elected in 1932.
Sure. I think it's very, it's terribly important that and I think this is one of the great things Robert does in Munich, is that he allows us to see a situation as it was seen at that time, not as we see it now, translating it back to that time. There were a lot of things that we didn't know, that people didn't know, or that a lot of people didn't know. And I think when you're dealing with a historical subject, it's very good to have that perception.
Yes. And also a lot of, I think, what we need to be aware of is who writes our history. Chamberlain died of cancer just over a month after the Battle of Britain. So it's really Churchill who not only led the country, but got to write its World War II history.
That's
so,
right.
We have to be aware of the filters that sometimes do color aspects of our understanding. Robert asked, was Chamberlain in touch with Roosevelt to coordinate strategies towards Germany?
There had been, there was communication, of course, because we badly needed help. But there was no help forthcoming at that point, and I think Chamberlain understood why. Just as he knew that the population of England had no desire to go to war, he also knew that the population of America had no desire to go to war to help. What was this? It was one country that they probably never heard of, Czechoslovakia. Part of that being annexed would mean nothing to people living in Omaha. So I think Chamberlain would have not counted on any support coming there yet. And of course, we didn't know how long we were going to go to war for. I mean, it was what? It was 6 years. Nobody had any idea of that. We sent in an expeditionary force to France. Absolute disaster. It was chased back. We managed to get them off at Dunkirk. And then really, the European war, we were at home preparing, building up our Air Force, building up our Navy, while Hitler rampaged through Europe and tried to rampage through Russia. Yes, there was war in North Africa, but actually we were retrenching after Dunkirk. And it wasn't until D-Day that, with the help of the Americans, we powered back into Europe and started pushing the Nazi army back. But for a lot of the war, England was, we had the Battle of Britain, we had the bombing, we were just sitting on our island, sort of shattered and shuttered, trying to get supplies in from America. But of course, the Atlantic convoys were being submarined and torpedoed, but yes, we had enormous help, both in ships and in supplies from America. But we were on our own for a good 2 or 3 years.
One of the questions in the box was, did you shoot during COVID? And did that affect anything?
Well, it's quite expensive shooting with COVID because you have to test everybody. So if we had a crowd of 300, those 300 people had to be tested. Those tests, I think, cost about 70 euros each. So that, they had to be tested every 2 days. We all had to be tested every 2 days. So that really added to the expense. We lost 1 or 2, I think 3 people in all had to be removed from the unit. Fortunately, it didn't spread. We were all masked, apart from when the cameras were turning, the actors would take theirs off, but everybody else would be masked. We were all, as I say, tested. We had no vaccinations at that point. We were living rather isolated in our hotels because for most of the time there was lockdown in Berlin, in Munich, and in Dresden. So our producers would have to go out, find chefs who would cook and bring food into the hotel so that we could eat. Yeah, so it was affected by lockdown. I think it affected the budget considerably. I don't think it affected the standard of the work, but it did make it a little bit slower sometimes, but we coped.
Yeah. Now, quite a few people have mentioned the wonderful young actor, George McKay, who plays Hugo Leggett, your assistant, your secretary. And
Yeah.
Many of us saw him in 1917, the film Pride, Captain Fantastic, and Ophelia. What was it like working with him is a recurring question.
Well, I was very impressed by George. I mean, I'd seen him in 1917. I hadn't seen his other work. But an enormously concentrated young man. He gets into the character completely. He never stops working when we're on location. And a very serious actor, very talented, I think, and a lovely man. So that's how it was. And I'm very admiring of him.
I agree. And by the way, my husband, Mark, just came in with a note for me, a reminder that Winston Churchill said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it," unquote.
I never knew he'd written that. Very good. Very good. Excellent. Yeah.
Mark doesn't use the chat box, but he's forever giving me important information. He even brought in the book that,
excellent.
that makes it clear. Now, I want to mention that you've been playing a fair number of real people lately, including in House of Gucci. And congratulations on the SAG nomination for Outstanding Cast in a Motion Picture.
Thank you very much.
I have a photo that I just wanted people to see, because even though your Neville Chamberlain is so persuasive, you look exactly, in my opinion, the way I have seen him in newsreels, but you get to play Rodolfo Gucci. Can you show us the photo, Christine? We have one. Yeah, I just want people to get a sense of this rather different kind of character. The only thing he might have in common is a mustache, but my goodness, it is a different kind of mustache from that of Chamberlain.
Yeah.
And A.O. Scott's New York Times review says that Rodolfo is played by, quote, an impeccable, sepulchral Jeremy Irons. And I'm going to take a moment here. What led you to accept the role of Rodolfo, the father of Maurizio, who is played by Adam Driver? Was it more because Ridley Scott was directing, or the quality of the screenplay, Sarah Forden and Roberto Bendiveña, or the wonderfully chilly, imperious elegance of the character Rodolfo?
Well, no, it was the chance to work with Ridley again. I mean, we'd made a picture, which of course I can't remember, and you will probably remember, together about the Crusades 20 years ago.
I just blanked on it, sorry.
It'll come to me. Kingdom of Heaven, it was called.
That's it.
And I'm a great admirer of Ridley Scott. I love the way he shoots. I love particularly that he shoots with 4 cameras, so it's very quick, and he captures anything we might do which we hadn't done in previous takes, which take the scene into a slightly different place. When you're shooting with 4 cameras, you can get it all at once, and it's wonderfully liberating for actors. Very intelligent director, very artistic in that he's got very painterly eye, technically superb, and I'd work with Ridley anytime. I mean, there are, directors you can count on maybe 1.5 hands around the world who I won't name, but who I would work with on almost anything. And although sadly Rodolfo dies rather early in the film, and he actually didn't look very like me. He was sort of smaller and a bit sort of thicker, but with what I had, I thought, well, let me try and find a sort of Italian, sort of semi-aristocratic, because although they weren't aristocrats, the Guccis, they were very wealthy and had been wealthy for some time. And so they lived the high life. To try to find someone who's Italian, who the audience would believe. So I took my moustache, my vast moustache, and I took it down till it was a little line, which gave me enormous pleasure. The simple things of life,
And were you also happy to be working again with Al Pacino? Because you had done The Merchant of Venice together, which Michael Radford made back in 2004. Was that something that appealed to you?
Of course. I mean, Al is one of the greats, and he, after Merchant of Venice, became a friend, and it was delightful to. Sadly, only one scene, well, a couple of scenes with him.
Yeah, people are writing, love this scene. Now, and by the way, I love
largely improvised, I have to say.
That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I mean, Al and I had a sort of vague notion about what we had to say in the scene, and Ridley allowed us a certain freedom, which I think gives it life.
Well, here's what A.O. Scott proposed, and forgive me, but I have to give you this line. Casting Pacino and Irons as siblings is a witty move. At this stage in their careers, both exist at opposite ends of the thermal spectrum. If Irons were any chillier, he would crystallize. If Pacino ran any hotter, he'd burst into flame, unquote.
Very good. Very good, yeah. But we work as actors very, very in a similar way. And so we're very comfortable playing together. And I think that helps, you know.
Well, my husband, Mark, reminded me that in the opening sequence of The Merchant of Venice, your character, Antonio, spits directly into the face of Pacino's Shylock.
Yeah.
And Mark wondered, in connection to what you just told us, he wondered if that was scripted and required Pacino to agree, or was there some degree of surprise in that action of spitting?
No, that was scripted in the script. Yeah, so he was expecting it, I'm afraid. I'm not a great spitter, strangely enough. It's not something I do a lot, and it's quite you gotta have ammunition. It was I thought a spattered spit where I think it should have been a great, anyway, but it worked. But no, he was expecting it, I think.
Well, it was shocking for the viewer, that's for sure. I mean,
Good.
and do you like to be surprised by what actors do, or do you prefer control? And can you think of a moment of working with another actor who did something that caused a reaction in you that you did not expect?
Oh, always that's what you're looking for. I mean, there will be too many to remember. The great actors. I mean, I remember a wonderful moment in French Lieutenant's Woman where Meryl did something extraordinary. I don't know if you remember, but there were two stories. There was the story of the actor and the actress, me and Meryl, or we weren't called me and Meryl, but we were actors playing these two historical characters. And we have a fight in one scene. And I throw her to the ground and she hits her head. And she did this extraordinary thing, which really surprised me. She lifted her head and went, oh, as the actress, not as the character. As if to say, that was a bit strong, wasn't it? And there was a moment, and then she went back into the character. And it was brilliant, a brilliant piece of a brilliant moment in cinema. Yeah, that surprised me. But, all the good ones, that's why I often say that acting is a bit like playing tennis, and what you want is someone knocking balls back at you, which really surprise you and which make you run where you thought you wouldn't have to run, play in a way you didn't expect. And that is what I love in theatre and in film, is to be surprised, to be pushed, to be knocked out of any plan. I think I said before, what makes God laugh? It's when you tell him your plans. And I think of acting like that. I don't want to know what someone's going to do. I don't want to know what I'm going to do. I mean, I know what the scene's about, but I want my reactions to be, and I think that's what we're all looking for as actors. Our reactions to be pulled out of us by what the other person does. And if that's planned, then somehow it softens it all, and it's less real, it's less interesting. So working with the great actors like Pacino, like De Niro, like Meryl Streep, like Glenn Close, who surprise you all the time and who keep you on your mettle, that's so important to create. I remember a moment I was working with Glenn in the theatre. Now, I might have told you this story. Stop me if I have. I was working with Glenn, and we were playing on Broadway. We'd won the Tonys, and we were packing out, and it was very hot, and we were doing a matinee. And I came off after the first half, and it's awful to admit this, but we've been playing about 8 months. Same thing. This was a hot afternoon with a matinee, maybe an audience not quite as bright and sharp as we hoped for. I came off and I thought, I'm being so boring. I'm so bored. I mean, I've been doing this on endless. Glenn came upstairs past my dressing room and looked in and said, oh God, it's so hard this afternoon. There's no life. I'm boring. And I said, I know, and I'm the same. What are we going to do? I said, I'll tell you what, go upstairs, change, because she had a costume change for the interval. Come down, I'll make you a cup of tea. And I've got an idea. So she came back down in her new costume. I said, right, now, I'll tell you what we're going to do. When the curtain goes up, I'm on stage and she comes on. I said, when the curtain comes up, I don't know where I'm going to be on stage. I don't know what I'm going to say and what I'm going to do. But I do know that I'm going to do everything in my power to make you laugh or make you dry. In other words, forget your words. And I want you to do exactly the same for me. Well, they called us down. I was standing behind the curtain goes up. Glenn comes on. We play the scene exactly as we normally play it, but watching the whole time to see what the other one was going to do to make us laugh or make us forget our lines or just to put us off. Like two racehorses, watching. And the scene just flew. And the second half was wonderful. And I thought, that's the art. That's how to keep drama alive, whether it be in a little scene in a film or whether it be in a long-running play. Keep each other watching. Don't let them know what you're going to do. And yeah, so it's great to work with someone like Al, who you never know what he's going to say and therefore what you're going to reply.
Anyway,
it brings it to life.
Sorry. And a few people, of course, recognized that you were talking about The Real Thing, the play for which you won a Tony. And that led to a few questions about, and I was going to ask this as well. I mean, you're working so prolifically in film, and yet you are a stage actor as well. Do you have the time or inclination to return to Broadway or another stage? And actually, Kimberly wrote, Jeremy, you were fabulous in the Gods Weep play. I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, that was a play we did in Hampstead. How nice that you saw it. Not a perfect play, but an interesting play. It was the Royal Shakespeare Company some years ago. The answer to your question, Annette, is yes. I mean, the last play I did in New York was Long Day's Journey into Night, the O'Neill, which we played at BAM. And, it was the most wonderful experience. We played in London, we went to BAM, and then we went to Los Angeles. And it's an extraordinary play. I was playing opposite Leslie Manville, who was extraordinary, and we had a wonderful cast. And the problem is that when you do a play like that, or indeed when you do a play like The Real Thing, or some of the Shakespeare that I've done, it's very hard. Your bar is very high. So when someone sends me a play and says, will I come to New York to do it? I think, well, yeah, doesn't drive me into hysterical happiness, the idea of the play is just, it's all right. But, you know, when you get to my age, which is incredibly old, you try and fill your time with things that really interest you. So to do a play for the sake of it, much as I love coming to New York, I wouldn't really do now, whereas in my 30s I might have done. So the bar gets higher, and when you've done things like Long Day's Journey, to find a play which would pull as much out of you as that does is hard.
No, that's right. Aviva Weintraub was asking, do you have a preference for playing the good guy, so to speak, or the bad guy, or a complex guy? Is there a preference there?
I never see the difference. I mean, I think we're all, as human beings, incredibly complex. You know, we're good guys some days, we're bad guys some days, we're always complicated. Now, great writing gives you that. So I would say that what I love doing is working on great scripts, such as the O'Neill, such as Shakespeare, such as Pinter. The problem always with writing is that there are very few writers who create that complexity within characters. That's what I love, and I never judge them. I never think of them as good guys or bad guys. I don't know. They're just like all of us, trying to do the best we can in a particular situation. They will be judged by outsiders as being good or bad or whatever. But when you're playing them, you're just struggling to deal with life, and so that's, you know. But I do veer towards enigmatic, complicated characters. They're just more, they have more meat to them for the actor.
And you play them brilliantly. I mean, when I think back to the film for which you won the Academy Award, Reversal of Fortune, you're Claus von Bulow. When I think of Dead Ringers, there is, and people have mentioned Dead Ringers in the box, you know, your approach to that. But obviously we are coming towards the end of our time that we have with you, especially because for you it's a little later at night. I just one or two quick ones. Anu was asking, do you have a favorite performance of your own in looking back at your filmography?
No, I'm always hugely disappointed. I mean, thank God I don't have to write my own reviews, because they'd all be bad. I know what I was trying to do, and I always fall short. When I think back to my movies, the ones the happiest memories are the fun we had making them, if we did. Doesn't always happen, but normally. And so my favorite films are the ones that I had. I mean, I suppose, you know, I look back, I look at The Mission, which was a life-changing time for me making it. Extraordinary experience. Fortunately, it's also a wonderful film, I think. But as far as judging my performance, no, I always give myself a 2 out of 10 for trying.
I think you could give yourself a little bit more, especially when it comes to Munich, The Edge of War. Those of you with us tonight who have not yet been able to see it, as of Friday, it will be on Netflix. It also, I learned, has been playing at the Quad Cinema in Manhattan downtown. You could see it on the big screen, which is even better. But we, despite the number of extraordinarily complimentary things that I can't read all of them to you right now, nor can I share all the questions, unfortunately. But I just want you to know that you have
a few. Are there any rude comments?
No, I couldn't find a single one.
That's unusual. That's unusual.
No, I think it's partly because those who sign up for an event with the two of us, they kind of know that you are a brilliant actor and a very articulate spokesperson for the way that you approach and deal with a role. And I am a rather respectful moderator who never allows nasty questions or silly questions to enter if I can help it. But at this point, we are just going to let you finish your cigarette and your beer and go to bed soon. Although I will tell you, because I'm seeing it now, one of Karen wrote, I've seen all of your wonderful performance, or many of your wonderful performances, but this is the first time that I have seen your smile. It is beautiful, unquote.
Oh, that's nice. Thanks, Karen.
And by the way, one of the other advantages of Zoom, when we are on a stage where, you know, a lot of people are sitting very far away from us, the nice thing is there is an intimacy. We are seeing you now up close and personal in a close-up, and that enables us to feel even more close to you than we do already.
That's nice.
Thank you so much. And I trust that that House of Gucci and Munich, The Edge of War will find an ever larger and appreciative audience. Thanks for joining us.
It's always nice to see you. It's always nice to hear the wonderful things you say. You're a very generous hostess. And I've enjoyed this, and I'm only sorry that we can't share a hug when the cameras go off, because there's an ocean in between us.
Next time.
Yeah.
Pleasure postponed. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone who helped put this together. Munich, The Edge of War, Netflix on Friday. Good night.
God bless.